Okay, welcome back to the third lecture this morning. We're going to hear a continuation of the fascinating story we've just heard. It's going to be focused on the engineering aspects of the equipment that was involved in the Phoenix experiments, and Preston Nichols is going to be our next speaker. Preston received his BSEE engineering degree and is the director of the Space-Time Laboratories. He has been studying the interaction between subtle energies and psychotronics and psychic activities for nearly 20 years. He is the originator of the Bioson radionics broadcaster, BioPhys bioactive sound system. He's been investigating the Phoenix project at Montauk Point, which we just heard about. And he's an old-timer to the psychotronics group here, and he's going to talk to us today about the specifics involved in the equipment that was used in the Phoenix project. Welcome, Preston Nichols.
Good morning, people. You already know who I am. I think we'll say at this point that our purpose here is not to prove whether or not this project happened. What we are here is to discuss what they did, how they did it. Mr. Billick already discussed very well what they did. So we'll go into the meat of it. Essentially, the Montauk project was a very large mind amplifier. That's essentially all it was. I have here a very simplified block diagram.
You get back up on the platform until you get you.
Well, the trouble is I'm having trouble seeing the diagram.
Okay, go ahead.
I can be right here. All right. Very simplified was essentially a transmitter. We had an input network, which was the Montauk chair, that's what we called it. Mr. Cameron, sitting over there in the red shirt, was the psychic that sat in the Montauk chair and fed information into the computer system. The computer system essentially processed the information and spit it out to the transmitter. We had two transmitters, drove one of two antennas. There was also a Delta T antenna and a 100 kilowatt noise amplifier. This was the basic outlay of the Montauk system. Nice feedback. We will first discuss the Montauk chair. There was two versions of the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair was developed by ITT, Royal Communications, for the government, or whoever developed this project. The chair had essentially three coils in it. You can see the Y coil went like this under the floor, formed two sides of a pyramid, came out. Another coil came up, formed the other two sides of the pyramid, came out. The third coil was essentially two coils, one on the floor and one on the top. These provided three outputs of essentially an RF signal. The signal looked like white noise, essentially. But the correlations in the white noise was the information of what the person had in his mind sitting in the center of the pyramid. I have to apologize for my drawing. It isn't all that great. This should be right under the point of the pyramid. And the receiver system looked essentially like this. You had your three loops. You had your three basic receivers. They used a very standard type ISB detector system using the phantom type lock. How that worked, we had the receiver, which we'll have a more detailed diagram of. We had the carrier processor, which was essentially a very narrow band filter that converted from the IF of the receiver down to a very low frequency signal. They had the discriminator, which would just essentially form an AFC loop between the receiver, the local oscillator, which was injected into the receiver, and the thing would lock up theoretically a pilot carrier that was transmitted from the transmitter, but of course in this system there was no pilot carrier, so it essentially attempted to do a lock on the noise, and this made the whole thing coherent essentially based upon the noise. And then the output came to the ISB detector. You had the carrier injection. You had 3 of these channels with 6 outputs. This is a detail of how the receiver system worked. The basic receiver, the SP600, was a standard type receiver with a pre-selector RF amplifier mixer. The LO was switched out of the circuit. That was from a separate assembly. Had 2 IF sections, second mixer. And the BFO CW detector became a third mixer, supplied 25 kC. You can see the carrier processor had limiters and 20 hertz bandwidth filters and all that neat stuff, which is very much similar. Technology was used quite commonly in the 50s and 60s and the 40s to receive communication signal. They converted down to 2 kilohertz again, went through another limiter, went through a discriminator, very similar to what's in your FM radio. That's why we show the S-curve. That's how we show a discriminator. Went back into an FM reactance modulator to the LO stage, and this whole thing locked up. There was a 25 kilohertz crystal oscillator, which supplied the carrier for the detector. The signal came out 25 kilohertz, went through filters that were very closely matched for phase and frequency response, and provided the 2 outputs. This was the first chair. They had problems with this chair inasmuch that this coil structure was open. It picked up from outside as well as from inside. They had to locate this chair at Southampton, which was about 15 miles away from Montauk, so it wouldn't feed back to the transmitter. The thing would feedback, lock up, and cause all sorts of problems. So they had taken the output of the Cray 1 computer and microwave linked it over to Montauk. Of course, if you had any sort of little time glitch, reality glitch go through the microwave beam, this thing was spitting back information at such a rate that it sent the whole system into oscillations and caused all sorts of problems. So they came up with a second version of the chair. Okay, what we can do also is we'll show you the equipment that was used on the first version of the chair. This is a Hammerman SP600 as modified by ITT. In fact, you can see ITT Worldwide Communications here. This is the back end of it. Anyone knows an SP600 can recognize that this module is different, this module is different, the layout of tubes in here is entirely different. This is the carrier oscillator. You can see Mac-K radio, which became ITT. In fact, this piece actually came off the Montauk Air Force Base. You can see the rust on the tubes, because the Montauk Air Force Base was a very damp, rusty place. And you can see this technology is quite old. This is their carrier processor. There's the very narrow band filter. You see this also came off the Montauk Air Force Base. Of course, the SP600 receiver I still use. These I don't use. In fact, I haven't even fired these things up because I'm a bit afraid to plug these things in. There might be a lot of smoke. This is the discriminator module. Of course, what's on it? ITT. I'm sorry. And this is the upper-lower sideband detector. Of course, what's on it? ITT. This is the back end of that with all the ancient tubes. You know, those are those glass and case FETs. This is essentially what the first chair system looked like. Now, based upon information they've gotten from crash UFOs and technology exchange, whatever, they found out that essentially you could put the victim between a set of Helmholtz coils. Helmholtz coils are interesting because they can be phased as such that the pickup would only be between all the coils and would exclude to some extent all the junk outside. Now, of course, if we go back, we're not going to do it here, to the pyramid antenna structure, this is something known as delta T or delta time sensing pickup type structure. This is one of the things the pyramid does. It does translate time waves. Now, of course, they had to get the delta time structure in the receiver. We'll go into that in a few minutes of how it was actually done. They used the exact same system, except they replaced the Hammerman SP600 with an RCA receiver designed back in the mid-30s, by a man known as Nikola Turbo, who really was Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla understood the delta time factor, and by placement of coils and such in the receiver, he replicated the pyramid factor, if you want to call it that, for those people who are not going to go through all the delta T factors and stuff like that. And they replicated the pyramid coil with the receiver. Of course, the block diagram is the same, except that the RCA receiver had different IF frequencies and all that nonsense, but we don't have to go into that here. You can see I have in parentheses the different IFs and the changes that they had for the receiver. This, of course, is a picture of the RCA receiver actually taken off the Montauk Air Force Base. Again, you can see the moisture damage. This particular one I haven't fired up. I fired up the others, which I've gotten out of RCA. They're in much better shape. As you can see, this one's missing a tuner. And if we go inside, we can see this thing was designed when Bob Butlick was a young man. And if we go to the back, let's go to the front. These things are each individual coil stages. This thing, they apparently, for some reason, didn't want to use a gang tuning cap. So each individual section of the preselector was an individually tuned network. They had separate tubes for each front end. This one's, of course, missing. And the local oscillator sat down here because this one was modified to use the remote local oscillator that was locked. So you can see that's all missing. They got two nice, neat little boxes here that do convert down to the IF module, which I don't have pictures of because it looks like this. And if we go to the back, we can see every element in the vacuum tube has its own coil that sits right under the big coil. Although there's a big metal plate, aluminum plate in here, there is a higher order relativistic psychic energy quantum coupling between these coils and the coil up above. That's your delta T function. This is one of the secrets that Nikola Tesla had learned, how to place these coils to get time manipulations within this part of the circuit here. You got the same thing here. You notice this is very symmetrically laid out. Of course, this is designed back when Bob here was a kid. Of course, they used the same carrier oscillator, the same carrier processor, and the rest of the 9 yards of the stuff. And this chair, since it was somewhat shielded, they placed this system in a room right under the transmitter building, right above the delta T antenna that was buried. It was like 200 feet on the side. It looked like this over here, but you can get that later. And, of course, Mr. Cameron would sit in the chair. He would go into a trance, completely clear his mind. They would put a thought into his mind that they want transmitted, and he would think it. All this equipment would pick it up, process it through the computers. We now have a block diagram of the computer system. What's the first thing you see? 6 channels of A to D converters. Of course, there's no mystery here. I'm not going to go into what A to D converters do. That's analog to digital converters, 1 of 6, 6 of 6. The Cray 1 was the most advanced computer at the time. It had a 32-bit bus. They used a PDP-11 or a VAX-11 to interface to Cray 1. You couldn't talk to this thing direct. You had to use a smaller computer to talk to a bigger computer. Mr. Cray, he used his worldwide wisdom to design a system like this. And they had all sorts of peripherals. With this, they could sit Mr. Cameron in the chair, go through the whole 9 yards. The algorithms in the Cray 1 would break down what he was thinking into audio, visual, direct digital representation. They could display it on a screen like this, what he was thinking. They could type out what he was thinking verbally on words on a what looked like an old teletype, a KSR-33 teletype. I think we all remember those things clanking away a million bits a minute, making tons of noise. Nobody liked to listen to things, so they stuck them in the corner somewhere. And what did this do? This spit it into another computer. This computer essentially was used for storage of the information, and also they had to remove the thought form matrix from the thought form that Mr. Cameron was generating Input on the matrix, I represented the matrix of the transmitter. Remember, when you're requiring from the thought form that Mr. Cameron was generating, input on the matrix, I represented the matrix of the transmitter. Remember, when you're requiring a human being or a technological device to transmit a thought form, the matrix of that thought form has to match the matrix of the transmitting agent, or else nothing's going to happen, baby. So this computer will go through all the digital codes, remove the signature of Mr. Cameron, and put on the signature of the key person that designed the transmitter, because that's the matrix that was in the transmitter. Remember, this equipment becomes a conscious being. This is psychotronics, a conscious being this equipment becomes. It has a consciousness of its own. And just as you reject a form that is not yours, the transmitter will also reject the form which is not it. So this computer reprocessed from Mr. Cameron's matrix or signature to the transmitter's matrix, which was the head design man on the station. This, of course, went to another console, which controlled this computer. It controlled whether it was stored on magnetic tape, whether a thought form was played back from magnetic tape. An IBM 360 had big magnetic tape. It wasn't until later on they got the disc packs, which were by yay, but still they were magnetic. That took in double precision 16-bit bus. It generated a 16-bit signal. I'm sorry, this was 32-bit. It generated a 16-bit signal for this very specialized semi-analog digital computer designed by AIL, division of Cutler-Hammer. Of course, I used to work for AIL, division of Cutler-Hammer, and recently got laid off. And I went looking for information on this computer, and all the print numbers and such, they're listed on file, but there's no prints available, there's no titles listed at the number, they're listed as blank. Skip these numbers. That's quite interesting. And when I started to inquire, security went up like a rocket through the roof. You're not supposed to inquire about stuff like that. Well, the thing's right there, Montauk Point. This thing will go from that end of the room to that end of the room. Lots and lots of vacuum tubes. The thing was a forest of 6080s. The thing had this huge big canister in it which had electrical acoustical quartz delay lines, which turned out to actually can generate a consciousness in those darn things. I still don't fully understand it. And 16 bits of data went out. We got 17 lines of individual pulse modulations. This is where we differ from a radar transmitter. Also, the transmitter controlled the antennas, what was going on with the antennas, where it was pointed when they were using the directional antenna, or it would switch to different phasings and the different dipoles on the big stick that had about 30 or 40 odd dipoles on it. I never could count them. I'm not going up on the top of that tower to count the dipoles on the antenna. I'm crazy, but not stupid. And we go back to the transmitter. Notice we've gone here, we've gone here, now we're going to go here. Notice they got two of these monsters. We got two of these 100 kilowatt transmitters. This is now a block diagram of the transmitter. The basic signal is essentially a heterodyne type setup. What's interesting about this is the Stalo, which is a huge chassis with 5 crystal oscillators on it, electronically switched, means they can switch to 5 different frequencies. This is important for the Levinson transform. That was a function where you could translate frequency deviations to time deviations. It was delta F with respect to delta T, using differential equations and such. And I've seen the mathematics, and I don't want to go into it here. And we'll multiply, go into this mixer. Now this one could either supply a CW signal or an FM signal. Of course, we have a massive synthesizer supplying the signals for this. They have multiple mixers. They came up here finally with 425 to 450 megahertz. Now, they talk of synchrodynes. That name is right off a block diagram that's carried out personally by Preston from Montauk in '86. I found out what the synchrodyne concept is. In the initial transmitter, these frequency source was left continuously on this thing was pulsed synchronously, so either a lot of amplifier stages, or it would be enough gain to supply 1,400 watts of pulse power from probably maybe 1 watt here of pulse power. It would be high isolation off, high gain on. And that's all they did in the basic Sage radar transmitter. Except this group of nuts, what they did, they came along, they pulsed the mixers, and they pulsed each one of these stages individually. And I have recollections of going through pulse modulations and such, and they might pulse this one on, pulse this one on. It was a real crazy, odd setup for the way they pulsed these different stages on and off. What they're actually doing was loading a thought form here, shifting it to here, shifting it to here, loading more, shifting it, loading, maybe shifting it backwards, loading more. And they built up the esoteric function as the esoteric function bounced around in all these stages in the whole transmitter. Now, another aspect of this is what we have here. We have a noise source. This is a white noise source synchronized by Mr. Nikola Tesla's whirligig zero-time reference, which I'm not going to go into here. And they use this noise to essentially pulse noise modulate the stay low, pulse noise modulate the outputs of the synthesizer, which means you ended up here with a carrier with white noise modulation on it. If you go through your signal processing, you'll find out that white noise is 50% correlated to anything and everything within its bandwidth. That's right out of college, people. That's in your college textbooks. Look it up, it's in there. Which means this signal now is coherent to itself, and it's also coherent to hyperspatial functions, because white noise essentially comes out of hyperspatial functions. If anyone wants to debate that, I'll debate that with you later. And of course, they had their zero-time reference, which synchronized the white noise function. So at this point, they started to build the thought form within the pulsed signal. Of course, there's still no output here. They then split it and sent it to the other transmitter. The other transmitter was just this group here. You know, the pulse modulators and the 3 IPAs and the P8. At that point, it went into this IPA number 1, boosted to 7 kilowatts, went to IPA number 2, boosted to 75 kilowatts, went to IPA 3, boosted to a megawatt, went to the final amplifier, which is a first cousin to a magnetron known as an amplitron, which is essentially a backward slow-moving wave structure oscillator, which anyone's interested in, I can explain that to you what it does later. And backward slow-moving wave structure oscillator, which anyone's interested in, I can explain that to you what it does later. And goes through its different isolations, goes through the band limiting filter, so this thing doesn't spread to hell and gone and back and wipe out every TV on Long Island and wipe out every radio on Long Island. You know, this thing spread as far and wide. And then they produced 12 megawatts here. They lost a megawatt in the isolator. It means you have to water cool this. They lost another megawatt in this filter. That was water cooled. And if you look in the Montauk station, you'll still see all the water cooling equipment in the antenna room for these. And it went out to the antenna. Of course, these stages are individually pulse modulated also. So we had 14 pulse modulation points in this transmitter. Of course, the human ladder structure is based on 7s, 14s, or 21. It's the magic number 7 again. And they built the thought form by pulsing all these stages, and they did some weird ways of pulsing. This is essentially how the transmitter actually worked. As I said, I'm not going to go into very deep technical detail here. Anyone interested in it can see me later, and we can go much deeper into technicalities of this. I'm trying to give you people an overview of what this did. You can get the tape and the paper, and this will all be in it, and you can study the block diagram and such. What we have here, pictures again. That's the stay low. I apologize, it's a terrible picture. The camera went kaflooey. This is the best of the 2 pictures I was able to take. This is 5 channels of crystal oscillators, multipliers, summer, other amplifiers. This chassis multiplies it, and this is their noise source chassis. You can see this noise source essentially is a noise tube fed into a very wideband, high-gain IF strip, and at this point you got tons of noise. The bandwidth on this is maybe about 10 megahertz. And all this stuff here was a synchronization from the 30 hertz sine wave they put into that port there, and they took the noise out of a port here. This, of course, is the synthesizer that drove this, which is the FM oscillator, and this is the first mixer in the system. Use a power stage at 101 megahertz, and this thing provided all the frequencies for this oscillator and this oscillator and all that other good nonsense. This also was modulated by the white noise source, and this chassis also, one of these stages, is pulsed by the white noise source. It's right there. There's one of these ports over here that goes through amplifiers here that pulses these. But these tubes, if you look closely, not in this picture, you'll see these tubes are added later. And they just pulse one of these amplifiers. Remember, this frequency generator chain was essentially in the old stage transmitter on continuously. They used a synchrodyne to get the on-off effect. Because when you start up a crystal oscillator, it starts, smooths up the frequency and stays there. They wanted to be able to pull out a pulse which was exactly on frequency at all times, and switch from one pulse, one frequency to another frequency, and always be on frequency. So all these oscillators here and these crystal oscillators here had to be up and running continuously. And they had trouble with phasing and such as the different mixers came up, so the whole RF generator chain was on constantly. Although this mixer in the Montauk project was pulsed. They didn't care about the phase, apparently. This is your final mixer. This, of course, has a 3CX100A5 tube in it, which some may recognize as a 2C39 from World War II. That's that nice little White House tribe that puts out 100 watts. Then we go back to our block diagram. We now will look at the synchrodyne. This is 8 stages, each one 3CX100A5s or 2C39s. And voila, there they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. People, they had these nice, expensive ceramic IMAC triodes in here. You can see where they blew air through them. Each one of these has an air input and an air output. And this thing sat there, and this built up at least 50% of the thought form in these boxes. These are cavities. You know, TEM mode cavities. These darn things. Now, these were 72-14 Ceramo-Rock pentos, which are about that big around and about yay tall, had rings on the bottom for the electrodes. These sat in cavities about yay long and about yay square. It had huge fans blowing them. They had 2 of these. This thing, this tube is 6952, looks like a robot. That tube is about yay big around, has a round section like a flying saucer, about yay thick. It has things sitting down that you connect to it. It has 2 legs sitting down for the water cooling, 2 legs going up for the water cooling. It has the plate on top, and the thing actually looked like a robot. That was this stage here. That thing put out either 50 kilowatts CW or a megawatt of pulse power. That's a lot of power, people. This, of course, was waveguide at this point. You'll put this into a coax cable. You got so much voltage in the coax cable, you get any of albeolic standing waves. Of course, they're not albeolic standing waves. Folks, that's right out of your college textbooks. That's out of your tech school textbooks. If you had a standing wave problem, you could sit and watch your coax cable explode. I think we've all seen coax cables explode from SWR. That drove this big thing, which we'll have pictures of later. All these stages were removed from the Montauk site. I'd love to know what they did to these stages. This is one of the things we don't have. We're assuming that these stages look like these stages, just bigger. I'm not sure. Because both screen rooms that had all these stages in them were gone. Screen rooms there's nothing in them. They went to the Amplatron, they put in 600 kilowatts of power, got out 12 megawatts of power. I already went through this. And they provided a signal to the antenna. This is a picture of the power supply. This is the power transformer. If we can focus it a little. Three-phase input, three-phase 20 kV coming out here. This thing I'd love to put on Bob's back. This is one of the one of the Thyratrons. They use 4 of these monsters in parallel. This is a 66 megawatt pulsed Thyratron. 66 megawatt pulsed Thyratron, a hydrogen Thyratron. The whole thing sits about that tall from the floor. The tube itself is about that big around. They had a cabinet with 4 of these, boom, 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 hooked up in parallel. I went to the pulse network that Mr. Bielik described. This is the Amplatron. Of course, you can see where the welding was done, the cutting to cut the transmitter apart. You can see some welding marks here. This thing, the tube sits from here. You can see the cooling. And it sits right down into about here, inside of an oil bath. The pulse transformer is down in here. As Al said, they already had capacitor networks. Each network had 5 capacitors. They had 3 groups of 5 capacitors in the network, 15 capacitors they used totally. It was a typical type pulse delay line, with inductors in series and capacitors to ground. They charged up the caps and then shorted the one end of the line and dumped the other end in the pulse coil. So much for the transmitter. This is a picture of the building this transmitter sat in. This is a 100-foot by 150-foot tall tomb or a monolith from 2001. You can see some of the antenna up there. And this is the 2 floors. You can see some cooling that the transmitter sat on. They had cooling tower standing outside this thing. They had a field of pole pig transformers sitting next to it. They fed this thing with over 2 megawatts of power. The generators in the power station, they were pumping at least 2¼ megawatts into this thing. I'd love to know where all the heat went. Must have got hot around there. I really remember it was hot. We're now going to discuss the antennas. Can we focus again? The first diagram I made said overall blotch diagram. So I had to fix it. Oops. Great. I fixed it, the block diagram. They had 3 antennas at Montauk. They had 2 above ground antennas and the Delta T antenna below ground. What they actually did was they used the reflector to reflect out away from the subject the burning rays, the microwave oven rays. The etheric component, being it doesn't know any solid matter, passed right through the reflector, and essentially the etherics went out parallel with the gain horn feed, as the gain horn would send it. They had this big monster waveguide switch to drive either the omnidirectional antenna or the directional antenna. They also sampled the pulse from the final pulse-forming network and fed it into the windings of a Delta T antenna. What is a Delta T antenna? Let's now look over here. This is a Delta T antenna. How do you make a Delta T antenna? It's easy. You wind a loop diamond shape on x-axis. You wind another loop at 90 degrees to it, diamond shape on the y-axis. And you wind a third loop, diamond shape, around the perimeter of this thing. What does this thing look like? Here up is one pyramid. Here down is another pyramid. This is 2 pyramids, base to base, one pointing up, one pointing down. You build up a thought form in here with the XY loops using the correlated white noise. It will grab the thought form and rotate it. It will spin it into a cylinder, and as that cylinder is rotating, it has to bend time to get the rotation. It means now you're generating ricklets of time coming off this rotating cylinder, and this is a time vortex, as talked of in quantum electrodynamics. So as this thing spins, the imaginary cylinder in here spins, or it's called a spinner in physics, it sends out a field of time waves. All right, let's go back to our picture. And again, they take the output of the noise source from our transmitter, put it into a 100 kilowatt audio amplifier. Boy, I'd love to have that one, people. But they took that one with them. I would have got that out if I could have. They took that one with them for some reason. That went into the horizontal coil. And the two pulse modulations from the final network went into the X and Y coil. Now, by feeding RF into the omnidirectional antenna and feeding the baseband into this magnetic antenna buried underground, this was the same function that they had on the Eldridge. The Eldridge, remember, had an antenna on the top of the mast and magnetic coils on the base. So this, of course, was much more tighter controlled. Here is a picture of the directional antenna. Here is a picture of the cherry stick on the back, which is the omnidirectional antenna. Can we focus it? You can see a lot of 2-inch coax cables going into this thing. There's a phase array box. There's all sorts of relays in there. I wasn't brave enough to go get those out, or to go up here and take this. That's still there. And you can see dipoles, just 3 on each side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 36 dipoles was in this big cherry stick. Of course, we have a picture of the Delta T antenna for the videotape. Now, we have a demonstration here. This is my own edition of the Montauk system. The CD player, or the mind amp source. You can find out information on the mind amp by looking at tapes from the Chicago conference, or you can get my paper on the BioFist, which explains the mind amp. The quantum correlator is essentially an analog computer that correlates the ones and zeros. It goes to the amplifier chain, drives the XY coil. Then we have a noise source going to the Z amplifier, driving the Z coil. Now, this is very quickly our surplus store. So much for that. Now let's have our demonstration, the fun part. I'd like to have 4 volunteers from the audience to come up and just sense, get a feeling of what this is doing. Yes, ma'am. You won't disappear into hyperspace.
About 40 years.
What I have is I have a picture here. I'm not going to show you the picture. I'm going to sit it in the small mind amplifier. This is a quadrature function that goes this way, just like the chair is. Sit it in the small mind amplifier. This is a quadrature function that goes this way, just like the chair is. The output of this goes to the computer. Here's the noise source, goes to the amplifier. The noise source goes to this amplifier, goes to the antenna. What's here is being transmitted here. You all of a sudden may notice, how many people notice like a cooling, a sudden cooling in the room? That's from this. Now, I'd like you people to just essentially close your eyes and tell me where you feel you would be standing right now if you weren't in this room, based upon what you're feeling. You're feeling something unusual from this. Everybody in the audience, I think, is beginning to feel the cooling. Okay, man, where do you think you would be?
Then get a table. He was thinking a table there, it seemed like.
Okay, sir, what do you...
Same place I am right now.
Okay, sir.
Freshman maybe I was driving in a car somewhere.
And you, ma'am?
In the field.
In the field. What's in the field?
Grass.
What else do you pick up?
Trees.
Yep. What else?
Plants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What else? Rocks? Yeah. What else? All right. I'll now show you the picture. Somebody said water in the audience. Here, can we get it on camera so everybody can see it?
There you go.
We have a woodland scene with trees and a babbling brook. We have a woodland scene with trees and a babbling brook. This lovely lady picked up the thought form being transmitted. And I can tell you honestly, there's no collusion between any of us. It doesn't mean you people are no good. It just means she has a more open psychic sense. That finishes the lecture demonstration. Let's now go to question and answers. You got it on the camera, good sir? How are we doing on time? 5 minutes, okay. Yes.
Could it matter what angle the person stood in relation to the antenna and its various
Theoretically not, but remember, this is not ideal conditions, so it could be. Okay.
I have a question here. You talked about quantum coupling between the two coils in the chair. How does that relate to what Bearden has been telling us about scalar electromagnetics?
Well, Bearden, when he talks of scalar electromagnetics, is essentially what I call a potential wave. It's there, but it's not there. I believe that definitely couples into that, definitely.
So that is, we're talking, this thing is a scalar generator or a detector, or both?
That term, scalar.
Well, I mean, I use that term because of our,
Scalar has become a catch-all for anything that's non-Hertzian. It's a non-Hertzian pickup.
Preston,
Yes,
anybody sitting in the chair, would they have an experience of time travel or anything like that happen to them? That's the first thing. And the second question is, were there the future scientists that our previous speaker spoke about, do you know who they are by name or occupation?
Yes, but I can't say.
Well, in the first question then, people sitting in the chair, were they
remember, the person sitting in the chair was deeply, deeply entranced. His conscious mind was deferred and pulled off to who knows where inside himself. And the primitive mind was allowed to surface, which is a very flexible, pliable function. Yes, Alan?
Yeah. Could you please describe the design of the amplifiers, the three amplifiers, and...
Leave it to an audio man to ask about the amplifiers. Do I have something to write with? It's a very interesting design. It's what's called a distributed line amplifier. This is a design that goes back to the year 2, this amplifier. What it is, it's essentially a delay line, a coil, with capacitors to ground. I'm going to show you a 3-section version. They terminate the line, put in the signal, and then you have 3 amplifier stages. This is an old-style way of getting broadband amplification. I read a number of descriptions that describe this line as differentiating with frequency, and the one closest is either the highest or lowest of the band, and the next one is the next part of the band, and you got another part of the band. Of course, what do? They sum this thing the same way. Output with the capacitors. This is what's called a distributed line amplifier. Now, the interesting point on this is essentially all these amplifier stages, and those amplifiers is 10 of these, 5 groups of push-pull. They essentially, electrically, have the gain of the amplifier, the voltage gain of the amplifier, but etherically, these things add on a real strange, screwy setup. So this amplifier has more etheric gain than it has electrical gain. Another question.
Yes, by doing this time travel experiment and by going back into the past, if you made a change and caused another reality, how would you know at this time frame if you made a change?
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Can you answer that one? No, we can't answer that. We don't know. It's the same as the chicken and the egg. I'm not trying to put you down, ma'am. It's just, if you change the past, you're going to change the future. You know what's happened in the future based upon what you did in the past, so you're probably not going to know what happened. It's going to be one of these closed loops where whatever happened between you and the future and you and the past becomes a separate reality and is separated off the timeline. Watch Back to the Future. It's a very childish movie, but some of the time concepts are quite accurate. Yes?
No more questions? That's it. Okay, thank you.
I'll be around to answer more. I'll be around to answer more questions. Get out.
Well, what a fantastic introduction to day one of the science. Excellent overview. And now we're going to hear another equally amazing set of stories from Dr. Al Buick, who is going to talk to us about his experiences with the Philadelphia and the Phoenix experiments. Dr. Al Buick was born in 1916 as Edward Cameron, son of Alexander Cameron, Sr. He was raised in Long Island. He attended Princeton University and later Harvard University, where he earned a PhD degree in physics in 1939. This is an incredible story. A few months later, he and his brother Duncan joined the U.S. Navy, were quickly made officers, and were assigned to the ongoing project called Project Invincibility at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. After the disastrous test, which we're going to hear about, of August 12, 1943, he remained in the Army until July 1947, when he was removed, brainwashed of all of his memory, and then given a new identity, Al Buick, and a new family. He completed engineering school in 1958, got a BSEE degree, engaged in a career as a consultant engineer until 1988, when he retired. Dr. Buick is now researching the secret government projects, especially in regards to the Philadelphia experiment and the Project Phoenix, which we're going to hear about today. He's lectured all over the country, and today the title of his talk specifically is From Philadelphia to Phoenix, the Psychotronic Connection. I'd like to welcome Dr. Al Buick. Let's hear a round of applause. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me all right? Good. The subject today is a little bit different than what I've normally done. Last year, I gave you a fairly detailed history of the Philadelphia experiment and how it tied into the Phoenix project. Today, my intent is somewhat different. I wish to show the background connections between the two projects, how they happened, the politics that was involved, and the interlocking controls, if you will, and the communication which resulted in the two tests locking to each other. how this really occurred and why, and what other problems were developed because of this. It's a rather involved story, but I only have 45 minutes, so I will again try to keep this rather brief. As you know, the fill-it-up experiment culminated in 2 tests for the Eldridge, or if you don't know it, I'll state it now. The original 22 July 1943 test for the Eldridge, which was bad enough in terms of the personnel problem, but did not lock up to the Phoenix project. And the final test, 12 August 1943, in which the ship went into hyperspace, and it was a total disaster when it came back. And the nature of that disaster actually was far greater than anyone realizes, and the potential was unbelievably bad. I wish to go into that and what happened and how it was averted. The Phoenix project actually has been covered very well by Preston Nichols, and he will be going into some of that today, and some resurrection of the technology and how it worked. So I will not go into that at all. Really to understand what happened in terms of the politics and what led up to it, we have to go back to the beginning. The project started, as I have previously stated, University of Chicago in 1931 with Dr. John Hutchinson, Nikola Tesla, and a staff physicist, Dr. Emil Kirtenauer. The important point here in the history we have to follow is what happened in terms of Tesla. In 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. 33 years elected, and he became actual President in March of 34. In those days it was March 20th. They've changed the date to 20 January since. And when he was in office, he invited his old friend Nikola Tesla down to Washington, as they have known each other since 1917, exchanging amenities, and President Roosevelt asking Tesla, well, what have you been up to? What have you been doing? And of course, the President already knew about the ongoing work on Project Invisibility, but there were other things Tesla had been into which were exchanged. And among other things, Tesla mentioned the fact that he had been in communication with extraterrestrials. Now, this very much intrigued the President, who, unknown to the general public, was very much interested in metaphysics and rather abstruse matters. He was very curious about this, and Tesla told him a little bit about it. The equipment had been developed for such communication by RCA, which Tesla had been a member and staff member since 1919. In 1935, he became Vice President and Director of Engineering and Research Worldwide, a post he held until 1939 when he retired from RCA. In that period of time, he developed some super-sensitive receivers, basically designed for RCA's use in overseas communication, and also a few transmitters here and there, all of which came in usefully to Tesla in his ongoing quest for knowledge. So he told FDR he had been in communication with several groups. Roosevelt was curious, can I talk with them? And Tesla said, definitely, well, I can arrange it if you wish, and he did. After which Roosevelt decided he would like to meet some of these people. And they asked Tesla, is this possible? And he says, I believe it is. He said, there's 2 groups principally you might be interested in talking with. He says, if you have in mind making any kind of a deal, because at that time, as everyone knows, we were in the midst of a terrible depression, and Roosevelt was looking for some means to get out of it, to end it. In those days, he was perhaps a little bit more altruistic than might have been the case later. So arrangements were made to meet 2 groups. First, the Pleiadians, and then later, a K group, as I call them, the Kondrashkin. He met first with the Pleiadians. They gave a pitch as to what they might be able to do to help. He says, fine, but I want to talk with the other group first before I make a decision. So we talked with the second group and decided in favor of the second group. And the Pleiadians at that point bowed out. And as a matter of fact, went over to Nazi Germany and made a deal with Hitler, which we'll not get into because that's another long story, but it does figure in the background precedent to World War II and the development of German technology. So Roosevelt accepted their offer of help, in which they said they would provide some new industries and other things. 1938, an offer was made to set up the entire new industry called atomic energy, which of course we have today. President Roosevelt was very interested and very receptive to the idea. And he consulted with his various advisors in the military, and the military says, whoa. If you let aliens set up an industry like this, even though it's on our home turf, and they are in essence controlling it and know where it can go, what happens? We do not have true control over it. What's going to happen in the future? Will we become vassals or slaves to them? The military advised against it, and Roosevelt turned his mind against it and so advised them, and they became upset and says, well, there's nothing else we can do for you, and disappeared into the woodwork. Well, in those days, of course, we did have intelligence apparatus, but it was not anywhere as near as efficient as today, and it did not have all of the niceties of spying, which we have now. So by 1940, Roosevelt was becoming very concerned. Where have these characters gone? What are they doing? They quite literally vanished as far as we could determine, or I should say the president and the staff could determine. He says, what are we going to do about this? Well, somebody came up with a bright idea. Mr. President, why don't we go out and find some of those psychics that are running around here and see if we can find some really good ones, and maybe they can tell us where they are and what they're doing. The president said, fine. Harry Bennett, who was then the president's right-hand advisor, was appointed the task finding some good psychics and setting up a secret organization. He did. That organization, founded in 1940, later became known as the Psych Corps. Very important for many reasons. It has been, until recently, the backbone and mainstay of some very high-level spying operations and intelligence on which many agencies have depended. Now, that organization in its infancy in 1940 was set up by hired psychics who could prove they had their stuff together and knew what they were doing and could prove it. And they were given new identities and put in a secret warehouse in Arlington, Virginia, at least initially, and went about their tasks. Whether or not they ever found any missing K people, I don't know. But that organization expanded. It was set up to be a permanent organization, and of course Harry Bennett had to look for a man to head it up and organize it, train the people, and set up a total program. They found such a man in late 1940. He was hired in 1941, and he set up the training programs. And from that point on, they were looking basically for pairs, identical paired twins, which were ideal for the type of training they were doing, mostly male, some female pairs. And if they couldn't find them as time went on, they did use computers to computer match, but this came much later. Eventually, the CIA was formed. They took over the organization, and that was in 1947. About 1950, NSA came into being, and they inherited the Psych Corps, and it's been under control of NSA ever since. So what did they really do, and what function did they serve? As time went on, and they expanded, and they did expand into about 50 operating pairs at their peak. They were perfect spies. They could penetrate virtually anything on this planet. And of course, after World War II was over, they were very interested in what they could do in terms of spying on Russia. Perhaps unbeknownst to us at first, the Russians also set up their own group, and there were several groups set up in other countries, but I'm only concerned with what happened here. The man who was chosen to head this organization up, and actually remained its director until he retired in 1984, was a gentleman by the name of Emil P. de Costain. Perhaps some of you have heard the name. I know a few people have, but very few, because he was very much undercover. He was born in 1900. A very unusual thing I found out about him, which hardly anybody knew about until after he had retired. He was himself a walk-in by guess who? The K Group. So if you want to do some spying on the organization that's spying on you, take over the directorship. And they did. Important for a reason, because of what it led into in terms of the two experiments. The Philadelphia experiment, as I previously stated, locked up with the Phoenix Project, and it could only lock up on a very critical date. And that critical date was the 12th of August, 1943, and the 12th of August, 1983. Theoretically, it could have locked up in 1963, but there was no ongoing experiment at that time, such as the Phoenix Project, which was required. Dr. John Van Neumann was, of course, the second and final director of the Philadelphia experiment. He was also the first director of the Phoenix Project when it came online after the war, and it went through several phases. But the important phase of the Phoenix Project was from 1975 through 1983, when they developed the capability of time travel and the time tunnels, as Dr. Carl Sagan liked to call them, the wormholes in space. Wormholes in space and time. They had the capability and was fully functional. Someone had to know, in order to get these two experiments on either end to lock up, that there were critical dates in which it would work, and the rest of the years in between it would not work. And someone had to communicate this information to both ends. And this is the thrust of my discussion, and what happened, and why this whole thing locked up, and what some of the mechanics of, and technology of time is all about. I have a few slides I will add and put in here a little bit later, but I want to get into some more of this material first. The director of the Psi Corps himself was obviously a psychic. He went on through the period of time, and because he was a member, in essence, of the K group, and most of your aliens have the capability of time travel, they knew what was going on at both ends. I've stated in the other prior lecture, and I'll have to state it again. The real purpose of the two projects, quite aside from the patent scientific advancement which was desired by our scientists here in the United States and on Earth, was the purpose of locking these two projects up for a very specific reason. The very specific reason was to provide a rift in space-time 40 years wide and hold it there long enough to let some very large spaceships through from another time frame dimension. Now, in 1947 onward, the K group was pretty much lost. And came 1954, there was another group which came into purview of the government, and that was, of course, the Greys. There was a series of UFO crashes in New Mexico in 1947, 48, and 49. I won't go into them in detail. But because of that, the government sent a call out through the vast array of radio telescopes in New Mexico, a call for help into outer space. We have an alien here. We don't know what to do with him. He's ill. How do you take care of him, et cetera, et cetera? Is there anybody out there that knows who he is and what you do with him? The government got an answer. It took a while, but they got an answer. A group of small ships showed up in about 1953 with some Greys on them, and there was an exchange of ideas and thoughts, and some hostages went both ways, with a promise of return in 1954, which the Greys did do in very large numbers, landed at either Edwards or Holloman Air Force Base, or both. Eisenhower disappeared out of Palm Springs in one of his golfing weekends to Edwards, met with the aliens, and signed an agreement, a non-interference agreement, in which we agreed not to interfere with each other's civilizations, and there would be an exchange of technology. Well, the non-interference agreement didn't last very long, because it became very obvious to our government that the Greys weren't keeping it, and what exchange of technology took place was not perhaps all that was expected. The important point was that our government agreed to provide bases for them underground, some 75, full underground railroad system. Construction started in 1959. But the Greys came in very large numbers. We don't know how many. The government perhaps does. It's estimated now they're probably in excess of 1 million. And a very large ship that came in wanted to orbit around Earth, and they provided shuttles down to the surface of the Earth. They could not have gotten through without that rift in space-time. Now, they were here. Other groups were here. There was a group from Orion. They actually were in charge of, in many respects, not formally, but in charge of the scientific development of the Phoenix Project. Therefore, they knew what it was capable of. They helped set up the science and the technology, and they also knew of the critical dates. The dates of 12 August is actually the function of the Earth's biorhythms. The Earth has a series of biorhythms, 4 of them, which, like the human biorhythms, do peak out once every so often. Nobody in our scientific community knew anything about this. It turns out, from what I've learned, that the ancients knew about it. Let us say, the recluse lamas in Tibet and elsewhere knew about it. They do have a great deal of knowledge. And they knew that the Mother Earth is actually a living entity, unlike the rock science, which is taught to us in the colleges, and has a sort of consciousness, perhaps nothing we can understand. But nonetheless, as a living entity, has its own biorhythms. And those biorhythms, 4 of them, peak out once every 20 years. A window approximately a day wide, usually falls on the 12th of August, plus or minus a day, because our Gregorian calendar is not all that accurate. It misses 0.24 days per year, and once every century you have to add a year to correct the calendar. Nonetheless, that was known to these aliens. Now, Emil Castaigne was in the middle of this, and he had to provide a connecting link, and as did also the aliens. Where we were in 1943 with that test, we had no knowledge of any kind why that date which was handed to us for the second test, the 12th of August, which was given to us as a drop-dead test, which came from above the office, the top office personnel, namely the Chief of Naval. We knew the order came from beyond him, but at that time we had no idea where from. It came out of the little White House. There was 2 gentlemen in there who more or less had the knowledge and the communications. Harry Bennett provided the authority, and Dr. Castaigne provided the connection. And the drop-dead date was handed down on the authority of the White House to the Chief of Naval Operations that it must be conducted by or on the 12th of August. But the problems we had, the Navy knew, and those people knew, that Dr. von Neumann was going to delay as long as possible, and the final test would get as much time as possible. He worked around the clock trying to correct the problem, because he knew he had a serious problem, and they could not correct it. In any case, they waited until the 12th of August, which was the desired slot. On the other end, we had the Phoenix Project. Now, what is the history, very, very briefly, of the Phoenix Project? Its hardware became functional about 1975 in the earliest phases. Preston Nichols has gone into this heavily in the past. And by 77, it was operational. By 79, all the changes had been made. And it was signed off as a functioning entity, a fully operational project in 1980, and it was functioning from that point until it crashed on the night of 12 August 1983, sabotaged. That, however, is not germane to this part of the story. On the 1st of August of 1983, something very unusual happened. Prior to that time, the operation of the station, the Montauk operation, Project Phoenix, had been on an intermittent basis, several hours a day, maybe 8 hours a day, once every 2 or 3 days, whatever they had going in the way of a project where they wanted to utilize the equipment, they used it, but it was never used on a continuous basis, day after day. On the 1st of August, an order came down through the channels that the station would be turned on and left operational continuously until further notice. That meant around the clock. And it was. Now, what did this mean? I'm going to first show you a few slides, and I'm going to get into a little bit of, shall we say, whiteboard operation to show some of the aspects that are involved in terms of the time. I've shown these slides before, but perhaps it's a good reminder. The Philadelphia experiment took place in outside. I've shown these slides before, but perhaps it's a good reminder. The Philadelphia experiment took place in outside of the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Where is the pointer?
It's right
Ah, there it is. Right opposite a little town, if we can get a little better focus, entitled called Red Bank, is where the Philadelphia Navy Yard is, still, though it may not be after this year is over. They are threatening to close it. The Eldridge was docked here. When they ran the test, they went down the river here a distance, quite a distance, to where the bay was at least 2 miles wide. was about a mile on this point. They went further down the line here. This is, of course, a picture of the famous Eldridge file shot. I will not go into the equipment other than to say the main body of equipment was in this little cubicle. That was the door where we went in and out. In the test, there was a special antenna mast on top here, designed by T. Townsend Brown. A special omnidirectional phased array to handle the output from 4 transmitters. And this was the ship for the final test that was used in the Philadelphia harbor, further down, of course, away from Philadelphia. The Phoenix project took place on the extreme end of Long Island, way out here on the tip. And there was a park there. There's a town of Montauk a little further in. There's a state park out there and also a military base. It does not show in this photo, actually mapped by AAA because this is the most recent one. The earlier ones show the military base inactive. Fort Hero, in the extreme end, had been there since 1916 perhaps, prior to World War I, and was abandoned in 1986 after all the tests were over. But that was where the other end of the terminal, shall we say, of the 2 experiments took place, out here, and that was the Phoenix project, the prime home. At one time there were 25 operating ones, and that was the one that caused the lockup, the one that was primarily concerned. In case you haven't seen any of the photos, I'll only show 2. The main radar tower from the SAGE system, which was adapted and changed to the Phoenix project. There's this, and that's what you see driving east from Montauk. It's a huge building and a tower with the antenna on top, which is 60 feet high and 120 feet across and weighs approximately 125 tons. And close up, if you get on the base, which is open, and you can wander out there if you want to, but go during the day. This is the tower, 8 feet, approximately 8 stories high, and with the antenna, the total height is about 150 feet, and we estimate. Now I'm going to leave this slide on because what we were dealing with, very briefly again, in the structure of our universe as we know it, is a 5-dimensional universe, 5-dimensional nature, other than is in the blackboard. And time is of itself, as I think this slide is familiar to Bob Yedlick, is in the form of a huge torus and is a structure. This is a mathematical representation, of course. You have a central flow of time through the center, a more or less linear flow, which we call the time we measure, the 4th dimension. And of course you have this helical coil on the outside which actually establishes the time rate flow. And this is called T2 and is actually the 5th dimension. Now what I need to get into here a little bit is what really goes on. This is somewhat poorly done, but I'm not a great artist. We'll call this 1, 2, 3, 3 dimensions of physical reality as we know them. And according to theory, Einstein et al., time at the right angle, we'll call a 4th dimension, is at a right angle theoretically. These 3 physical dimensions flow and exist in time. If there was no time, our reality, our physical reality would not exist. So supposedly these are at right angles. It flow according to a rate which you can describe in the torus of time. But there's another important aspect, and this is the very important one. We actually have a 5th dimension, we'll call it T2, which is the 5th. And it is, if you look at it on end from the torus, take a cross-section, this is a neat little thing which is really another vector on the end of the 4th dimension, which is the 5th. And this thing is describing, in essence, a circle. And as it corkscrews ahead, we call it forward time by mere reference. We don't know whether we're going forward or we're going backwards. It depends upon which universe you're looking at. But it creates the 4th dimensional vector in the center, which is a more or less even flow, theoretically very even. We'll not go into other problems which could change that rate in terms of the universe. This was what we were playing with in the project, and actually this is what they were playing with in both projects. It is time in its essence. Now the Eldridge had a field created around it, the purpose of which was, again using the pointer and looking at this, the purpose of which, when the confined field of the Eldridge, was to change the helical rate. If you change the helical rate, you change the time flow, but you don't want to speed it up to the point where the ship disappears. What you want to do is something rather exotic. I'm saying what you want to do because what they wanted to do and what they did do are two different things. Speaking in terms of looking on the end of this, let's say this torus, our reality here, we'll call it reality 1. You have a second reality at 90 degrees, a third and a fourth, and you can even have a fifth. The second order reality is at 90 degrees. But you don't want to take the average that far in terms of the time element. You're rotating it around the torus, and what you do, you start pulling it around by speeding up the corkscrew. Then you, at that point, by going back to the normal rate, so that at 60 degrees, approximately, the Eldridge is optically invisible and radar invisible. If you stop a little before that, which is what they did in the final test, let's say perhaps 45 degrees, it's radar invisible, but not optically invisible. Almost, but not quite. So you rotate it and you hold it in terms of what is within the field. What's outside, theoretically, you don't worry about. Well, that was the theory, and of course the aspect of this is very interesting, namely the Eldridge and the generators were creating a sixth order field so that they could manipulate the fifth order field, which was T2, or the second order time. And we have five dimensions, if you will, 5 orders, however you want to express it, in our reality. And again, going back to what Bob said the other night, which is very neat, you have a 6th dimensional order, which is an isolation between the next 5, which is the reverse universe, actually the contraturn matter. And if you go beyond the 11th, as Van Neumann knew, you then are in hyperspace and the 12th order. To get this project to work in terms of shoving the Eldridge into hyperspace and creating the bubble and creating the entire rift in time required a 12th order function. Now, the Eldridge was capable of a 6th order function, which would not do it. And I remember some of the discussions of Von Neumann after it was all over, and as he would say, this was in later years, well, the Eldridge had a 6th order capability. The project here at Phoenix had an 8th order capability. Where did the other 4 orders come from? They came from a very interesting function. The Phoenix project normally could only produce an 8th order function, but it had the capability in terms of its memory systems and the actual network, the lattice of the LC networks, which were the energy storage networks, and the way they were designed, they could store etheric orders of energy. Because it was a 25th order network, could store up to 25 orders of energy, up to the 25th. By turning the system on and the station on the 1st of August and leaving it on continuously, approximately every 24 hours, because they went through the entire torus of time through plus and minus infinity, they added 1 order of reality. After 5 days, they were the 12th order. And by the 12th of August, they were well beyond, because they left the station on continuously, and of course hoping there were no breakdowns, which there were not at that point, thanks to Preston Nichols and his engineering. It kept running. Now, the other aspect which was unknown to us was, of course, the biorhythm problem. Let us go over to another page. biorhythms I will only draw in terms of how they peak out. They produce literally a spike. 12 August, 12 August, 12 August, in 20-year intervals of concern to us, and also 2003. Here sat the Eldridge until it moved. And here sat the Phoenix Project. It did not move. It was rather well anchored. And in the middle in 63, there's essentially nothing. There's another peculiar thing happens. As you start this business of going through time, let's mark this as 43, let's mark this as 63, and let's mark this as 83. You are looking at it on sidewise again. You're actually a full circle for the 40 years. It takes 40 years to go the full circle of 20 years where you have a synchronization point, you're 180 out of phase, which can be represented as a sine wave, like so, with a crossover point in 63. But this is a flat representation. This doesn't mean it's reversing polarity per se, but it does. The problem was created, and the problem was created is this. Time also has waves. Like a standing wave in electromagnetic theory on an RF transmission line, if you don't damp it properly and its characteristic impedance, let us show theoretically a nice little line where we have RF on it, properly terminated, it's even, of constant voltage, and as we say, the standing wave ratio is 1. That means you have perfect transmission and there are no waves coming back at you. If this thing is not properly terminated out here in the characteristic impedance of the source and the transmission line, whatever you're using, you start to get funny little things. These things start to build up, and you start to come down here to a lower level, and these start to build up, and you start down to a lower level. You build up standing waves, and these things go up and they come back. And when it gets bad enough, you have enormous voltage levels. And theoretically, they can go unterminated out at this end. Theoretically, they can go to infinity. They don't, for practical reasons. But you get the same problem in time.
10 minutes.
Got it. And this means something very extraordinary. If you have standing waves in time, you will find that this time factor starts doing this. The standing waves produce a phenomena of standing waves which go back and forth, and if you start whipping through the 63 point, the crossover point, and create a reverse time wave, you then have, in the reality in which you're dealing, the artificial reality as well as coupled to both ends, and most particularly in the 83 end where the Phoenix Project is, you can generate, and they were in the process of generating, a reverse time wave. What happens if you have a forward and reverse time wave hitting the physical Earth at the same time? As I found out very recently, Dr. Van Neumann knew what the problem was and knew what could result. And they had to set up a special team prior to the critical date of 12 August 83 to handle the problem. Had they not found the correct team of scientists, there were 4 involved: Dr. Van Neumann, a second man whom I know but I will not give the name of because he doesn't want to give him, and 2 scientists from the future. Yes, I did say the future, because with Montauk they could go into the future or the past. They got a team together. They moved hardware to 1963 to provide damping, because they knew that if this thing... They got a team together. They moved hardware to 1963 to provide damping, because they knew that if this thing was not damped sufficiently, at least to a critical level, to prevent the reverse time wave from hitting, do you have any idea what would have happened? It would have torn the entire tectonic plate structure of the North American continent apart, ripped off the entire top level of the North American continent, probably to the Rocky Mountains. To a depth of 500 to 700 feet, the ocean would have roared in and we would have been back in the Stone Age instantly. That is what they faced, and that is what they had to prevent. And since I'm here talking to you today, they prevented it. Or we wouldn't be here, any of us. That was the problem they faced, and that is what they did correct. There was a code name for that project. The code name was Atlanticus Not Revisited. Rather interesting parallel. I'm sure some of you know the stories of Atlantis. They did successfully solve this, and of course the time rift was created without the additional problems. The aliens had what they wanted, including a stable Earth, because I'm quite sure they didn't want half of the planet ripped apart. Otherwise, what was their purpose in coming here? They wanted a viable planet with a society and civilization intact, which it still is. And that problem had to be solved and was solved. There are many aspects of this. I'm not going to even attempt to go into a math on this. In fact, I don't remember most of it. I think Preston could if he wanted to explain it mathematically. But this problem was solved. The whole thing was damped down, and these people disbanded. This was not a government project, believe it or not. It was privately done. It was privately run, and the people who were involved were non-governmental, and I question if the government even knew what was going on. Perhaps when it was all over, or perhaps till now. That was solved, and consequently it went on, and the physical aspects of our reality remained intact. But here you had that problem. How did you get this whole thing to settle up and line up? And how did you get the communication? Without the extraterrestrials and without Dr. Costain, they wouldn't have been able to put the pieces together in that fashion, because the test on the 20th or 22nd of July of 43 with the Eldridge produced no oddball effects other than the fact they had serious electromagnetic exposure problems to the crew. The ship didn't disappear, nothing happened to it. When it came back on the 12th of August, 4 hours later approximately, the ship had some physical damage, and of course the people buried in the decks and the bulkheads, they had a very, very serious problem they faced. That problem, in terms of the personnel, has been solved since. I do not know the exact technology in which they finally did solve it, but Van Neumann was requested in 1947 to go back and look at the problem and see if they could salvage anything. He did. He solved the problem. First, he had to invent a computer. The modern electronic computer is the brainchild of Dr. John Van Neumann. The Institute of Advanced Study. The first one built, perfected is perhaps not the word, but functional, in 1952, and a complete system involving a computer shipped to the Navy in 53 with another test on another ship. And I was not there because the Navy had decided it was time for me to disappear. And that test was very successful in 53, and they renamed the project, no longer Project Rainbow, but Project Phoenix. It was a big umbrella that covered many, many projects. Over many years, many generations of hardware, they did make it very practical. It is now on the B-1 and the B-2 bombers. It's on all the large carriers. The B-2 bomber, of course, being the stealth. And that system is totally functional without any apparent hazardous side effects. I was removed from the Navy in 1947. I knew too much, was learning too much from digging in the vaults of Los Alamos, and somebody with the communication up and down the line decided I had to go. But part of this problem and the damping out here from 43 to 83, as a Levinson equation state, there were standing wave ripples, which go on for another 20 years, out to 2003. This part had to be damped. We weren't concerned about the back end. So Duncan and I were specially set up and processed by whom I do not know and how I don't know. But we've been the stabilizing factors on this whole Levinson matrix, if you will, the time stability factor, which has kept everything stable. And after 2003, I guess we're not required anymore. Who knows what will happen to us by then. That was also part of the project called Atlanticus Not Revisited. I do not know what was done. but I do know it was accomplished. So I think we've fairly well covered this, and in a brief nutshell, the problems that were generated by those two projects were solved. Of course, Phoenix went down on the night of 12 August 83 from sabotage, and it's been out of operation ever since, though there is a new Phoenix at a different location, now essentially operational. The aliens knew what they wanted, they got what they wanted, and today we have a problem with the aliens that we'll not go into. I think that pretty well winds it up, other than to say my experiences have been put into a book entitled The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO Conspiracies. I do have a few copies upstairs on the table where Preston Nichols is located, and I also have a few left, I believe, in the bookstore, and they are for sale. If you have any other questions, I think I have about 2 minutes. I'll attempt to answer any questions at this point, and then I can answer questions later.
A question?
Yeah, gentleman, a lady back there with glasses.
If they have this advanced technology, what do they need us for?
They need us for two things. In fact, three perhaps, but number one, in terms of the technology, they need our capability to manufacture hardware to their specifications, which we are now capable of doing. And so far as the Orions are concerned, they're engaged in an advanced base operation in a general warfare. And there is warfare going on out in space now. We hope it doesn't come to the surface of Earth. The second part of this is, in terms of the Greys, they need us as warm bodies for genetic experimentation to develop a new race. And involving this is also the CIA and our government in secrets, very great secrecy. They are doing extreme genetic engineering and have developed a lot of new things, including a totally new class of implants, which are now biological, not hard chips. And this is only one tip of the iceberg. They need us for that. Yes, one other question?
No,
that's it.
Fine.
Okay.
Only 10 seconds left.
All right. I thank you all for your attention, and if you have any other questions, I'll answer them later.